This is The Rundown, your weekly news and review from Western Mass. Good morning. It's Friday, April 10th, 2026. I am joined by our rundowners this week for the very first time. Bill Shein from Reason Gone Mad. Anthony Cammalleri, now with the Daily Hampshire Gazette.
Good morning.
Jim Kinney from the Springfield Republican newspaper. And Phil Bishop from the NEPM newsroom. It's a full house here at the Rundown panel table this morning. If you have thoughts, email therundown@nepm.org and be sure to check us out streaming live now on YouTube. All right, coming up, our panel's thoughts on a couple of things headed to a vote, either by the legislature or perhaps heading to the citizens. The difficulty in filling some vacant state-subsidized housing units amid a wider housing shortage, and nuclear arms work in Pittsfield, the surge of money and jobs that it's bringing to the city, and a relative silence around the broader issue. First, some wider context for this week's local news. The partial government shutdown still in effect, despite congressional leaders, much fanfare earlier this month discussing a deal having been reached, and there is a ceasefire in the war against Iran, seemingly at points in name only this week.
Certainly.
Now, from the files of, everything that's been around for a while is potentially new again. We're going to talk about cannabis and social media. Let's begin there with the social media piece. As reported by WBUR's Nick DaCosta Clippa, the headline, some Mass lawmakers want to ban social media for young teens. How would that work? Well, Massachusetts may be behind most other states on school cell phone restrictions, but a new bill on Beacon Hill could propel the state to the leading edge when it comes to cracking down on the distracting devices for kids, both inside and outside of school. Wednesday, the House passed a bill that would prohibit kids under the age of 14 from using social media altogether, and in addition to instituting a bell-to-bell cell phone ban in K-12 public schools. Now, the piece goes on to say that the strict ban was motivated by growing concerns about how social media is affecting teen brains and mental health. Anthony Cammalleri, by a hair, you are the youngest individual sitting around this table behind Phil Bishop. Thoughts on this attempt to kind of put the genie back in the bottle?
Well, I mean, the biggest opposition to this legislation that I've heard so far is that it's unenforceable. And I think that just because not every student is going to follow it to a T, that doesn't justify not implementing some kind of cell phone policy. We've seen other school districts that have implemented a bell-to-bell ban report lower rates of student-on-student violence, more of a culture around students. Hallways are bustling again. Kids are talking to each other.
People are actually talking to each other?
Yeah. I've talked to
IRL?
high school. Yeah. I've talked to high school principals about this, and they report to me the eeriness of having a classroom full of 16-year-olds that are all dead silent before they walk in. They're not causing trouble. I mean, it's addictive. And like anything else, yeah, kids are going to be on social media, but there should be a time for learning and, a time for their phones.
The kids are chatting about ways to get around the social media ban.
That is true. I mean, we've seen it with some of the restrictions that we already have in place, whether it's signing up for certain social media apps and platforms. Kids are going to find a way around these to a certain extent. Phil, do you think that as the second youngest at the table, how do you think this is going to be received?
I think, it's a little bit of like a two-prong. Things like a bell-to-bell cell phone ban in schools is sort of one prong for, a particular material issue, which is kids being distracted. When it comes to actually banning social media use, actually stopping young children from being on these platforms, I think that's where enforcement is going to be the trickiest, part of the entire ledger. Kids are very smart. They understand the technology a lot. And this is in broad strokes, likely a little bit better than perhaps some of the lawmakers that are seeking to regulate it. I know 13-year-olds that understand virtual private networks to mask, where their online presence is coming from. And in turn, those are the types of things that can circumvent, things like age-related verification. I think that it is, and I agree with Anthony, I think it's something that is absolutely deserving of some type of regulation. These platforms are monolithic. They are not an unalloyed good by any, stretch of the word. We just had a really kind of groundbreaking case against Meta, which owns Facebook.
The $6 million that woman was awarded, who said from the age of 6, she was using social media platforms and eventually, felt anxiety, depression, and the like. Of course, the big tech companies disagree and say, this is sort of more of an individual issue this one person was struggling with. But there's a lot of data to support the potential negative
There's some brain
implications.
warping going on, and I don't think that anyone can say that that's not the case. I do think it is a toothpaste in the tube type of scenario. These
Gonna
kids
get a little messy.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's a worthy cause for regulators to try to tackle.
When we look at Bill Shein enforcement of this, the way that it's hammered out now, Attorney General Andrea Campbell's office would be responsible for rolling out these new regulations by September. It would also call for fines of up to $5,000 per violation for companies that don't comply. But what's the practicality of enforcing something like this, you think?
I think it's going to be quite difficult. But I think it's important to the conversation about some kind of democratic decision making about how these kinds of tools and products are incorporated into society. The old tech mantra of move fast and break things. Many of these things overwhelm society before there's been any democratic decision making about how and whether we want these integrated into everyday life. So it might be a little philosophical, but I think the time is right to have the discussion. These bans have run into a lot of court challenges, and the tech companies are well funded, large legal departments.
They've got the cash.
They do.
And you also talk about the challenges. Florida and Ohio, WBUR points out, have passed similar age-based social media limits. Those, surprise, surprise, are facing court challenges. Like you said, those deep pockets. But we've got, NetChoice, the trade group that represents major social media platforms, argue that age verification systems violate free speech, First Rights Amendment. But we also have the ACLU, also for their part, with concerns about free speech and privacy and the like. So two sides that you might not think would be sitting at the same table are sort of sitting at the same table around this
ACLU
issue.
and large tech companies.
They're skipping down the street hand in hand. Unlikely. But here for me, I'm looking at this 25 years, maybe a little too late on this. Phil intimated at this, kids might be more aware of the ins and outs of how these are working than the grown-ups in the room and now attempting to legislate it. And oh, by the way, AI, we're looking at how complicated AI is, who should have access to that. We're concerned about social media, rightly so. But what are we going to do about 14 and under who can talk to chatbots and plan lives or build them as best friends? Should the legislature be looking at also putting AI into this regulation while they're also taking the crack at social media? Too much at one time, maybe, Anthony?
As long as we have rules and teenagers are going to find a way to break the rules, I think. And when it comes to AI, there's a lot of concern there. I'm sure the legislation will catch up to it. But, I think this can't do any harm. I really don't see the harm in regulating, addictive programs for kids, especially AI and how it impacts their brain, how it warps their view of reality, at a young age.
I'm a parent. My kid is 7 years old right now, and I do worry. We try to limit his access to tech. He's already asking for a phone. That's a hard no. But also, NPR had a great piece back in 2023 by Corey Turner. It's called 10 Things to Know About How Social Media Affects Teen Brains. And it talks about many of the cons and some of the pros. So if people are looking for a deeper dive on that, we'll have a link to it in our show notes. Next step on this, the House's two-part bill heads off to the state Senate, which passed last year a similar bill, but the restrictions on cell phone use in schools, but it lacked the broader social media restrictions for teens. So we'll keep watching where this goes. Moving on, ailing Massachusetts cannabis industry fires up fight against a ballot measure headed for voters in November. Jim Kinney, you took a look at this one for the Springfield Republican. I love this writing. Expect your bud tender, a clerk at a cannabis dispensary, to start asking you, are you registered to vote? Or to start stuffing campaign literature in the bag with your purchase, or start directing you to a website with a QR code. Massachusetts' $2 billion with a B dollar a year adult use cannabis industry is seeing an upcoming ballot question as an existential threat. An act to restore a sensible marijuana policy will ask voters to once again make recreational marijuana illegal in the state. Jim Kinney, what are people saying about the odds of this passing in a $2 billion industry that we're just going to say, nah, we're all done?
Right now, the polls don't look good for this. It's down by all polling measures, and there's a lot of data that shows that people partake. People are customers of the industry in the state, and people like that it's legal. But if you just say, I'm up in the polls and sit back, that's a good way to become Tom Dewey or Hillary Clinton. They're going to have to fight it. They're going to have to get out there in the public square. So people are going to start seeing all those stuff that I wrote about. And it's also a complicated, ballot questions are tricky because on this one, yes means
it's that
no,
perennial
no means
fight about
yes.
what yes and no mean. Yeah. So the yes vote supports the ban in this particular instance. To your point about numbers, a 2025 report from the Cannabis Control Commission, the CCC, said 37% of Massachusetts residents reported using cannabis in the last year. So it's clearly seeing numbers there. U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, from 2013 to 2022, the number of Americans over the age of 12 reporting cannabis use rose from 19.8 million to 42.3 million. And daily use has increased 60% in the prior decade, again, according to Veterans Affairs there. Interesting look here. NPR's Rita Chatterjee reported in February on a new longitudinal study that finds cannabis use among adolescents increases the risk of being diagnosed with bipolar and psychotic disorders, as well as anxiety and depression years later. So perhaps this is where we're seeing some of this pressure coming from people who want to put this back in the bottle. Bill Shein, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that was at the heart of the debate when cannabis was legalized, was what the effect will be on youth. And I think we're seeing the increase, as well as still a lot of open questions about the health and mental health effects on young brains.
But from a jobs perspective, we're looking at something like 20,000 or so jobs in the state in this industry now. Phil Bishop, what do you think?
I mean, it's, and it, not to say that you an industry is so big and therefore you cannot do anything against it. I don't want to present that type of argument, but this is an industry that was born out of voter choice through a ballot initiative to recognize to allow recreational cannabis. It has grown organically, and I'll elucidate my bias here is that I have consumed cannabis in my life, and I've even consumed it before it was legal to do so in Massachusetts.
You and Bill Clinton.
But I think that there is absolutely an angle to talk about the ways that cannabis is not good for developing minds in the ways that many things are not good for developing minds, like alcohol, like nicotine, like social media. But to extrapolate from that point that an industry for an adult use substance that is pretty heavily regulated by the state, that has a lot of oversight to it, even if the CCC is not free of its share of controversy on how it operates. But I just think that it is not a winning message to take something that has entered the Massachusetts public, that is enjoyed by many people. I saw a lot of people at my local dispensary before the last two snowstorms when I went to go stock up, and many people in the East Hampton, Northampton area had much of the same decision to kind of get their own
Bread,
cannabis.
milk, gummies.
Bing, 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 So I just think that, the angle of that it is a drug, that it does have risks to it is real. I don't think necessarily that is a winning argument to tell the state of Massachusetts to take its multi-billion industry to the back of the shed.
And something I should clarify in bringing up the adolescent piece of this is adult use recreational cannabis, right? The law says 21 and older.
Kids
Jim
should not
Kinney.
be having it.
The industry will remind you, as they reminded me, that if this passes, everything just goes back on the black market. where you're buying from somebody on the street, you have a guy, versus getting it from a licensed dispensary that has a license that they want to protect and aren't going to sell to somebody who's underage.
And going back to something else that Phil said, it was passed, but Jim, you point out in your story that the 2016 legalization vote was close. 54% of people said yes, 46% said no. It leaves it up to questions, so you can see why the industry is maybe taking this seriously.
Different electorate, too.
It is. All right, so next steps. 4 shops sued last week to keep this measure off of the November ballot. They're challenging the constitutionality of the ballot question, so something to keep watching there in the lead up to November. All right, still ahead here on the rundown, vacant state-subsidized housing units in Northampton and what's slowing the process of filling them amid a wider shortage of housing, and the surge of money and jobs nuclear arms work in Pittsfield brings there, and why there's a relative silence around what historically has been a really controversial issue. A few thoughts, email the rundown at nepm.org. You are listening to the rundown here on 88.5 NEPM and streaming on YouTube. I'm Carrie Saldo. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the rundown here on 88.5 NEPM and streaming live on YouTube. Joined by journalists Bill Shein, Anthony Cammalleri, Jim Kinney, and Phil Bishop. It is a full house this morning. Anthony, let's turn back to you. Northampton Housing Authority addresses vacancies and takes a closer look at the Lipair investigation. You did this reporting recently for the Daily Hampshire Gazette. Just going to summarize. There are two kind of simultaneous issues being addressed here. The bigger one and the broader implications piece is filling 40 vacant units there in Northampton that are held in this state-subsidized housing. And then also they're closing the books on a long and costly investigation into the former executive director, Cara Lipair, over alleged ethical and legal violations. What's causing this challenge of finding tenants when we know there's this dire need for housing in the state?
Well, it seems that the issue has to do with unit turnover, just keeping the units in a condition where they can legally meet regulation and have tenants move in. That's at least what I had heard at the last Northampton Housing Authority meeting. And with that, they're teaming up now with the Greenfield Housing Authority, whose director used to work in Northampton before Ms. Laper. So
we're working on the pronunciation as well.
I apologize if she's listening. So, there's a hope that with this 8-week memorandum of understanding between the two housing authorities, that might help to move things along a little bit more, get some units ready. The current or interim director in Northampton had also mentioned they hired a maintenance director. So there could be some progress on this, but it's 40 vacancies is a lot, especially when there's a housing crisis.
And it's amid 570 housing units that are in that Northampton and Florence Housing Authority pocket. You also pointed out in your story that the Housing Authority has had some trouble getting residents vetted and moved in on a timely basis. And that piece really stood out to me because the Wayback Machine, 2023, ProPublica and WBUR did this in-depth investigation that looked at state housing authority across the state and found back then that 2,300 state-funded apartments were sitting empty, and that state families that had been promised action within 90 days, but then that failed to fix some key problems, and it left many families on this very long wait list that the state has waiting for a home. So it looks like the issue, at least this is my assumption, and perhaps it's not a fair one, that they were having at the state level is still happening at the local level. And meanwhile, the Donahue Institute report that came out, I think last year, Jim Kinney, says something like 45,000 new housing units are needed here in Western Massachusetts specifically.
And the condition of public housing has been an issue. That's something that came up in the big state housing bonding bill, that these buildings are old. There was sort of a boom of building them in the 1960s and 70s. That's been a long time ago. So, and you said that the condition of these apartments is an issue that could be just age.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, the housing stock in Western Massachusetts, putting on my realtor hat here, is aging. You know, the average age of a home is at least, I shouldn't say average age, but we have housing stock that's well over 100 years old. It's very common in Western Massachusetts. And as somebody who owns apartments, you're constantly churning apartments, right? People are moving out. You're prepping them for someone else to move in, make sure it's a habitable living condition. Now, the state does have some stringent guidelines, and for good reason. But you'd think that the state could check its own boxes, perhaps, and get people in here. I think it begs the larger question about what's it going to take to bring efficiency to the state housing authority program. Thoughts, Bill or Phil?
I mean, I really think that it's a mind-boggling scenario, like kind of when it's like stripped to the brass tacks, that there are these, these housing authority units exist. They are vacant in a time where Massachusetts, it's housing in Massachusetts, and maybe that's my bias from reporting on things like this, but like
you are doing a lot of housing reporting lately.
This is the big thing: is that there's not enough housing. Housing is substandard, and Massachusetts has really, it's a stated goal that housing is a top priority for this governor's administration, and so I just think it's a very fascinating thing when there's a lot of energy being devoted to attracting housing development, to stripping regulations, to ensure that there can be more housing development, that there can't also be a similar push to rehab these existing units that could be housing people, who are vulnerable, who need, like a housing authority dynamic to be able to afford that housing. I just feels like the spigot could just be turned on for something like this if the state wants to be throwing lots of money at housing. And for me, I think that's just really strange.
I need to quickly amend something that I said a moment ago. It's 23,000 new housing units Western Massachusetts needs, according to the UMass Donahue Institute 2025 study. Bill Shein, thoughts on this before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to the dollars, the cost of this, whether it's private development or public funds to rehab these units, aside from efficiencies in managing vacancies. That is the crux of the challenge. Where is all this funding going to come from to add new units, to maintain older units? We see that in Western Mass, in particular in the Berkshires. A lot of old housing stock. And a question about where is that funding going to come from?
Yeah, well, speaking of Berkshires, let's turn to your story titled Nuclear Berkshires. Welcome
nice segue.
To the Nuclear Berkshires. Thank you very much. A story in Reason Gone Mad online. In Pittsfield, Massachusetts, the rebuilding of America's nuclear arsenal is bringing a surge of money and jobs and little public discussion. You point out in this story, which I definitely encourage people to go and look at the online, some beautiful scrolly-telling, I think they call it, where you take a story and you scroll it down the page. Really adds to the drama, I think. You've got some drone video. You've got archival clips from the Eagle, Berkshire Eagle, and elsewhere. But you point out that Berkshire County residents, which I did not know, played a big role in the 1980s, helping to grow the anti-nuclear movement. You took a look at that history, and parallel to that, Pittsfield-based companies, past and present, making systems and parts that could fuel nuclear war. It culminated in this investigative piece that you titled "The Nuclear Berkshires." What sparked your interest in the topic?
A number of things. It's a really interesting intersection of a lot of really important issues locally, nationally, and internationally. My interest was sparked, I think, last year doing some reporting on public health issues in Pittsfield related to PCBs left behind by General Electric, and the economic effects of a one-company town when that company leaves. General Dynamics is the second largest employer now in Berkshire County. The nuclear-related work has been accelerating. It's not brand new, but over the last 10 years, it's been $1.4 billion in federal contracts, a little more than $800 million of that just in the last 2 years, and $450 million of that just in the last 4 months.
Wow.
So it's an enormous increase. General Dynamics is going from about 1,600 employees to what they say will be more than 2,000, so another 400 jobs over the next 2 years. And very little discussion in a progressive county that was instrumental in the early years of the nuclear freeze movement, Western Mass as a whole, but in the Berkshires as well. And very little discussion of it, both from public officials, activists. There's really not been that kind of anti-war or anti-nuclear activism in a long time, even as there has been a lot of progressive organizing, No Kings rallies, a lot of activism around the current administration. So that intersection of economic development questions, what are the downstream uses of things that we're making in the Berkshires? The geopolitical moment, particularly under the current administration. You don't necessarily think that the current president is the cooler head that you want involved in a minute-to-minute decision about whether or not to use nuclear weapons. That may be a slight bit of editorializing, but
You're telling me a guy who said a whole civilization will die tonight is not who you want to have their finger on the button?
Yeah, and I think that brings it home. And I think that some of the people that I talked to in the reporting, that's the moment that we're in. And the context, and just to add the key point, the United States is engaged in a nuclear modernization project, multi-trillion-dollar project over the next couple of decades to upgrade or replace every element of the nuclear enterprise. Not something that a lot of people know about, but that's the source of a lot of this funding that's going to continue to increase.
Well, the reporting really got me thinking on a personal level. I covered Pittsfield for the Berkshire Eagle for a while, and it did not occur to me to dig into this story. Shame on me for that. And it really got me thinking about how when I did report, or if I did report on GD, or my thinking in the back of my head is like, these are high, well-paying jobs for a lot of young people in a city that doesn't have access to many high-paying jobs, right? Because GE left town, speaking of one company town, and city government is happy for the job. So there's a real tension there.
Yeah, it's in some ways it's a dilemma. These are mostly engineering jobs. They pay six figures and up. It's attracting young people and young families to the area, which Pittsfield needs because it's lost a lot of population. The city councilman that I interviewed for the story, the only one that would speak about it, brought that up. This is a city. He's a young guy. He's 23. He also works at General Dynamics.
I was just about to say,
which
right?
made for a really fascinating conversation. And he came on my radar when he did a podcast interview a couple of months ago, where he was talking about this surge of money and jobs, and he said, war is good for business. Which is not something you normally hear elected officials say.
Right.
And it may or may not be true. There are questions about multiplier effects from defense spending versus other kinds of public spending, but there's no question that it's bringing hundreds of new jobs right now to Pittsfield, and likely more in the coming years.
I could talk to you about this for an hour, but let's just hear from you about what General Dynamics said in response to this.
They, as you might imagine, they believe that this is spending that helps defend the country. There was a pretty clear divide between activists who see this as dangerous and the companies that provide this strategic deterrent and they say it is an important part of defending the country and part of the mission. They said they're deeply embedded in the Berkshires and gave me some examples of things that they do to address concerns that people have about whether General Dynamics could pull up stakes and move somewhere else. And they do have people that have worked there for decades. So there are this particular kind of working on what are called fire control systems for Trident submarine-launched missiles, a lot of expertise there that they want to maintain. So there's an argument that it's less likely that they would up and leave compared to what happened with GE, but still a concern.
Yeah. You mentioned the activist Ira Helfand, who was the Nobel Peace Prize winner and founder of the anti-nuclear weapons campaign Back from the Brink. We've heard about that reporting in recent news here in Western Mass. You wrote that Helfand doesn't fault or demonize the people who build nuclear systems in places like Pittsfield, which I thought was really interesting. Give us just a brief summary of where he does find fault.
He thinks it's systemic. We've spread nuclear related spending around the country, along with other defense contracts. For many years, the strategy is spread them around congressional districts, maintain political support. But he said that he thinks that the folks who work in the industry believe they're defending the country. And the argument that activists make is we need to find other ways to utilize their skills.
Fascinating reporting in Reason Gone Mad. We will have a link in our show notes. That is our show for this morning. My thanks to this morning's panel, Bill Shein, Anthony Cammalleri, Jim Kinney, and Phil Bishop. Thanks to Bart Rankin on the board and Ayu Suryawan on digital, and Erin O'Neill for her help with the YouTube support as well. I am Carrie Saldo. You have been listening to The Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM and streaming live on YouTube. If you have thoughts, email therundown@nepm.org. Everybody get out there and have a great Friday. We'll see you next week. Thanks.